Welcome everyone to the second game between Divya Deshmukh and Stamatis Kourkoulos Arditis from Greece in the first round of the FIDE World Cup 2025. In the first game, it was Stamatis who managed to win, and Divya is now in a must-win situation with the black pieces. Never easy when you are facing such a strong opponent who's rated 2585, but Divya will have to go all out here and she has to try her best to win. She's the only women player in this World Cup, 205 men, one female player, and that's just very inspiring that Divya managed to take on this challenge. She accepted it, and now it's another big challenge here, a handshake, and off we go. Well, Stamatis starts the game with knight to f3, and Divya kind of surprised maybe with her opponent's first move, thinks for a bit and plays pawn to g6, and that's an interesting choice by her because it might be that she wanted to play the modern defense against 1 e4, but her opponent surprised her with knight f3, and now she anyway went for this. Will Stamatis kind of transpose it to 1 e4 by pushing his pawn to e4, or will he go into maybe the King's Indian territory with c4? That remains to be seen. He goes pawn to e4 and he transposes the game into the modern territory, and I believe Divya is now in her preparation. She goes pawn to d6, and Stamatis now goes knight to c3. When you have the white pieces and also draw is fine for you, that's a very comfortable situation to be in. And now we go into the Perk defense after the move knight f6. Some people call it the Pirks, some people call it the Perk. Not so sure about the pronunciation, but it's named after the famous player called Vasja Perk. Knight c6 played here, putting pressure. There are many other ways to play in this position instead of knight to c6, but Divya goes for this approach, and Kourkoulos now can push his pawn to d5. It's an interesting move. He pushes it, and it kind of forces Divya to go back. Knight to b8, and then go pawn to c6. I mean, knight e5 is also possible, but it would lead to trades, and Divya has this prepared, so she goes knight to b8. And now h3, which is a useful move because when you want to play your bishop to e3, you don't want knight g4 to be coming in. Pawn to a6 with the idea of pushing b5, and a4 stopping black from expanding on the queen side. e5 played here. Well, maybe Divya would like to go knight h5, knight f4, eventually f5, but there is en passant that happens in the position. D takes e6, bishop takes on e6, and now bishop to f4, brings his bishop in to f4, and the bishop is active here and well positioned. Black goes knight to c6. The knight is looking into the center, and also the e5 and d4 squares here, and maybe pawn to e5 is not possible because of knight h5 or knight d5 maybe, with the idea of d. Very interesting position. Kourkoulos goes rook e1, and he just wants to drop his bishop back to f1. It's a useful move. Divya plays her knight to d7, and so Divya playing on the dark squares. Bishop opens up, knight jumping to c5, other knight coming to d4. Very interesting. Queen comes up to d2, hoping to trade the bishops with bishop h6. Divya goes rook e8, trying to keep as many pieces as possible. Here she may want to go back to h8. So Stamatis now plays rook a to d1. You can see all the pieces very well positioned for white. But on the other hand, Divya can go knight to c5 here. And one of her threats is to take on c3 and chop off the pawn on e4. So bishop goes back to f1, defending the pawn on e4. And very interesting position here. Knight e5 could be an option, maybe knight b4. But Divya plays this very weird move f6. And I think this is just the match situation that is getting to her. She wants to play for a win, so she's going for g5 and so on. Stamatis plays on the queen side a5. If you take the pawn, there is b4, after which you lose a piece. So Divya goes back, bishop f7, now trying to put pressure on the e4 pawn. But look at that bishop on g7. It was a wonderful piece, now closed in. And I understand that Divya wants to go g5, h5, g4. That's her plan. But g5 pushes forward. Well, is it powerful enough? We'll get to see in a few moves. And now knight to h2. A very interesting maneuver. I'm not so sure where the knight is heading. Perhaps it wants to go to g4 to e3 to f5. King h8 played here. And pawn to f3. Aha, that's the maneuver. So wants to go bishop f2, maybe just strengthen the structure. Very solid play here by Kourkoulos. And knight to d5 played right into the center. Divya goes knight e5, putting her knight on a good square. But if you look at this position closely, you will realize that without doing too many things, white has managed to build a very strong position. Knight to g4. And now bishop comes up to g6 with the idea of pushing f5 at some point. Knight to e3. The knights are well positioned here. One of the knights could jump to f5. And knight e7 played, offering a trade of knights. Bishop comes back to f2. And queen to d7 played. White takes, knight takes e7. Rook takes e7 by Divya. And pawn to c4. Again, gaining space there. Queen e8. It's like as if Divya doesn't have too many things to do, right? Like just she's completely stifled here. Queen c2, another good move. Threatening c5 maybe. Pawn to h5 played. And he pushes c5. Rook comes to d8. And now Stamatis can take on d6. He takes cd. And Divya can take back with the pawn cd6. Now the d6 pawn is a big weakness. And white goes knight to d5. Fantastic. Step by step. Kind of dominating the position. Rook f7 and now queen to d2. Protecting the pawn on a5. Bishop h6 played. Divya trying to defend this bishop and go g4 perhaps. Opening this up. Rook c1. Looking at the c7 square. King h7 quickly played here, defending the bishop. Bishop e3. Somehow white has always very solid ways to meet all of black's ideas. Bishop goes to g7 back. And now bishop to b6, attacking the rook on d8. Rook comes up to d7. And king h1 played here by white. Queen comes to f8. And pawn to f4, a very strong move by Stamatis. But there is something that black can do here after pawn takes pawn. By the way, notice that we are closing in on move 40. This is move 36. And Divya has 2 minutes. Stamatis has 3. Now bishop h6 could be a strong move. She finds it. pinning the knight here. Bishop comes back to e3, and now bishop e4 could be thought of because there are complications with knight e6, but Divya takes on f4, and this kind of gives white a very stable edge now. Bishop takes, rook e7 played. And once again, Stamatis, because he needs a draw, this position is really comfortable for him. Rook ad1, rook cd1, queen comes to e8, and queen to f2 played. The queen is coming in to the h4 square, putting pressure on f6. And Divya now goes knight f7 with just 2 seconds on her clock. It was the 40th move for her, and she played it. She's managed to fight back quite well. I mean, she's managed to keep the position going. White is still better. Queen h4 is the best move found by Kourkoulos. Knight to g5. She gives back a pawn, which is again the best decision there. What a nice fight there by Divya. From a worse position, she has kind of gotten herself in a situation where it is possible to fight for the half point. Queen takes g5, and rook e5 played. The e4 pawn is a bit weak, so is the a5 pawn. And now queen to h4. Black can take on a5 here, but Divya tries to keep the position going. She goes queen d8. Yeah, but this is kind of a draw for, yeah, now like you are pawn down, rook takes, you trade queens. It's not going to help you win, and if you can't win, then yeah, the chances of going to the next round are gone. So rook d5 played here, and now rook takes on e4. By the way, the position has equalized completely now. Rook e d1 played, and Divya goes rook b4. Maybe better was bishop f7 with the idea of if takes, rook e1, king g1, and maybe there's bishop c4 business here. But she goes rook b4, bishop d3, Divya takes here, and now rook takes d3. h5 is hanging, so is d6. She takes the pawn on b2, but Kourkoulos first takes on h5. Check. King goes back to g8. Rook to d5, king f7 played, and rook takes d6. Takes on d6. Rook takes on d6. Rook takes on d6. And now rook to b5. So a good play here by Divya. Chances of draw are high. Check. King e6 played, and rook h7. So the idea is if you take on a5, I want to take on b7. She goes king d6, and maybe not the best, because you take on here a5, rook b7, and then go rook b5, so that if rook h7, a5, and somehow you try to hold this position to a draw, it's possible. But now h4, rook takes a5, and rook takes b7. She goes rook h5, but you can defend it with g3. And while, that's not a great move actually. Rook b4 was much better, and g3 now a5. Black is perhaps having chances to get back, but king c6, that's not a good move. I mean, a5 also, it doesn't seem like a huge difference, because you will go king h2, king c6, rook a7, there's king b6, and somehow the rook is kind of doesn't have space there. That's the point. King c6 goes back, rook b1, a good move. and now a5 by Divya, and now slowly rook a1, attacking the pawn. If the king comes up to b5, I'll get my king up. And the dream scenario, I think Stamatis wants the score sheet. It's 60 moves are done. So Divya is like, yeah, sure, you can ask the arbiter for the score sheet. And I think he just paused the clock there to go and find the score sheet, because after 60 moves you need a new score sheet there. And look at Divya there, she's not happy with Divya is like, can I start the clock? And yeah, king g2 played. King b4 and king h3. Now the what's going to happen here is that white is going to sacrifice the pawn for the rook, like the rook for the pawn, sorry, and eventually queen the two pawns. One of them will queen here. So h5 and Kourkoulos going there step by step forward. King b2, rook goes to f1, a4 pawn push, and h6. Such a nice move there. Divya goes back with just 1 second on the clock. Rook c8 played, and Stamatis just goes g5, rook h8, and now you can go king g4, king h5. Yes, he goes king g4. Divya pushes her a pawn, king h5, a2, in comes a check, king b3, and now you can chop off the pawn on a2. Yes, that's just clean. King takes a2, and now g6, g7 is game over. g6, and Divya thinking for, I think, some miracle, but it doesn't exist. Rook b8, and Stamatis goes h7 with the idea of g7 and queen. 73 moves have been played here. Divya Deshmukh is running out of time and also running out of the position on the board. She pauses the clock, resigns, and yeah, very nice that she said to her opponent, good game. I think Stamatis played brilliantly in this match, giving Divya no chances. Divya, on the other hand, fought really hard and fought very well, and kudos to her for just playing in this tournament, learning. It's not easy to face such stiff competition, so kudos to her. Stamatis goes through and will now face Nihal Sarin in round 2. Divya will get eliminated, but she's already through to the candidates for women's world championship title. That cycle, she's into the candidates, and she will be preparing for that. She'll also play the World Rapid and Blitz later this year, so lot to come for her. And for now, let's leave with this thought of great play by Stamatis and great character shown by Divya.